In the first portion of this videotape, the general procedure for the removal of the low-pressure turbine major module will be reviewed. For more complete details on this operation, refer to the engine shop manual. Facing the front of the CFM56-3 engine, the first step is to remove the spinner front cone. After removing the bolts from the cone, insert jack screws to help push the cone off. Take care to prevent the front cone from falling as it is removed. Next, remove the inner bolts holding the spinner rear cone in place. Here, the use of jack screws also will be necessary because the spinner rear cone has a snug fit with the fan disc. As the cone comes loose, make sure that it is supported and does not fall because it can be easily damaged. Toward the rear of the engine, detach any piping which would interfere with the separation of the low-pressure turbine major module from the rest of the engine. This includes the removal of the air cooling manifold assembly, the thermocouple harnesses, and the external piping between the low-pressure turbine and the core engine. At the rear of the engine, remove the cage assembly and flange assembly from the turbine frame in this manner. Remove the bolts attaching the cage assembly to the flange assembly and the oil inlet cover and remove the cage assembly. Then unbolt the attaching flange assembly from the turbine frame assembly. Use 6 jack screws to disengage the flange assembly from the turbine frame. The aft sump oil supply tube runs from the nipple assembly on the oil inlet cover to the elbow on the number 7 strut of the turbine frame. This is the number 4 and number 5 bearing oil supply tube and should be removed by loosening the B-nuts at either end. Next, take out the bolts which attach the oil inlet cover to the turbine frame assembly. Install the puller adapter onto the rear flange of the oil inlet cover and remove it from the turbine frame. Remove and discard the O-rings. Now engage the teeth of the wrench and counter torque wrench into the slots of the air oil separator nut and the slots of the center vent tube rear extension duct. Make sure that they are correctly engaged or damage to the parts could result. Loosen the air oil separator nut and remove it. Now the air oil separator itself may be taken out easily. Install a protector onto the center vent tube rear extension duct. The installation of the holding fixture is the next step. After loosening the 3 set screws until they are flush with the flange on the fixture shaft, insert the 3 retaining sectors and the shaft fixture into the aft end of the low-pressure turbine shaft. Install the shaft fixture by engaging the 3 dowel pins between the 3 retaining sectors. While holding the fixture shaft in this position, secure the 3 retaining sectors to the fixture shaft by engaging and tightening 6 short bolts. This prevents axial movement of the low-pressure turbine during removal. Next, position the shroud on the back of the boss with the scallop at the bottom position. Hold the shroud and turn the boss counterclockwise until it seats on the rear flange of the number 5 bearing support. Engage and tighten the bolts securing the shroud to the bearing support, and tighten the whole assembly by turning the boss part of the tool counterclockwise. The end of the lock screw must be introduced into one slot of the boss in order to secure the boss. Tighten this lock screw and jam nut. This prevents rotation of the restraining shaft. To accomplish the next step, a lift fixture must be attached to the handling fixture, making sure that the center of gravity is properly adjusted. Using the hoist, seat the handling fixture onto the rear flange of the turbine frame, aligning the top vertical marks. Using the bolts provided, secure the fixture to the aft flange. Check that the engine is aligned with the axis of the overhead hoist guide rail and make the necessary adjustments. Now install the core handling bracket set onto the left and right sides of the core. Save the engine bolts that are removed from the bracket locations and secure the brackets with the screws and nuts provided. Lower the turbine frame support. Now return to the forward part of the engine. Remove the retaining ring from the forward end of the low-pressure turbine shaft using a scriber. Next, remove the low-pressure turbine shaft plug using a puller adapter. Remove and discard the O-rings from the plug. Before installing the alignment fixture into the shaft, turn the knob at its end all the way counterclockwise in order to retract the jaws completely. Then slide the alignment fixture onto the fan shaft and turn the knob clockwise to secure the fixture by extending the jaws. Tighten the knob to lock it to the shaft. Install the fan disc balance weight protective sleeve inside the fan disc aft flange and turn the knobs to hold it in place. Install the guide and counter torque fixture onto the fan disc by sliding the nose into the lugs of the fan shaft. Exercise caution when inserting the nose of the guide fixture through the protective sleeve and turn the rotor to ensure the engagement of the guide and counter torque fixture in the fan shaft lugs. Seat the guide fixture on the fan disc and secure it with the 6 clamps provided. Position the centering pin of the guide fixture at the 6 o'clock position. Next, slide the low-pressure turbine coupling nut wrench over the alignment fixture. Simultaneously, slide the nose of this wrench onto the coupling nut splines and engage the spanner locator in the nut slots. Install the residual torque beam on the fan inlet case at the 6 o'clock position by engaging 2 pins in the forward flange of the fan inlet case. Secure this beam to the flange with the 3 bolts provided. Then install the residual torque adapter onto the residual torque beam by engaging 2 pins on the aft face of the beam and by positioning the yoke with the counter torque centering pin at 6 o'clock. Secure it with the 2 bolts provided. Install the torque multiplier onto the torque wrench by engaging the 2 pins in the guide and counter torque fixture and secure it with the bolts provided. Install a ratchet onto the wrench and the torque multiplier and loosen the low-pressure turbine coupling nut. Remove the torque multiplier and slide the torque wrench from the alignment fixture. Now the low-pressure turbine coupling nut may be removed from the nose of the torque wrench. After this has been accomplished, take off the residual torque adapter. The next step is to install the centering sleeve on the guide and counter torque fixture by sliding it over the alignment fixture and securing it to the guide fixture with the screws provided. After removing the protector from the threads of the centering sleeve, slide the pusher-puller fixture over the alignment fixture and screw it into the centering sleeve until it is possible to engage the lock pin. The lock pin provides radial retention in relation to the alignment fixture. Position the counter torque adapter by engaging the pins into the residual torque beam and secure it with the bolts provided. Position the roller of the pusher-puller at the 6 o'clock position and engage it with the yoke of the counter torque adapter stop, securing them with a lock pin. In order to maintain the fan trim balance characteristics of the same low-pressure system components when no component from the fan and low-pressure turbine modules is to be replaced, match mark the number 1 stage 4 low-pressure turbine blade to the turbine frame. And the number 1 fan blade to the fan inlet case. Identify the match marks with the engine serial number. Remove the nuts and bolts holding together the combustion casing and the low-pressure turbine casing. Take this opportunity to double-check to be sure that all of the connecting piping has been removed between these two sections. Now, on the accessory gearbox on the left side of the engine, remove the bolts and washers securing the hand cranking drive cover. Remove the hand cranking cover and the O-ring. Lock the core rotor at the hand cranking drive using the core engine locking adapter. This prevents the rotation of the core rotor during the removal of the low-pressure turbine major module. Engage the 8 jack screws in the forward face of the combustion case rear flange. Do not torque the jack screws in excess of 71 inch-pounds. Install the ratchet wrench onto the drive adapter tool and slowly rotate the fan counterclockwise, forward-looking aft, at the same time that the flange jack screws are being applied. Exercise extreme care in this procedure because improper use of the wrench can cause extensive engine damage. Carefully separate the low-pressure turbine major module 1.4 inches from the core module. Do not rotate the high-pressure compressor during this step, or damage to the inner air seal of the SH1 LPT nozzle could result. Also during this step, keep watching for the correct position of the module center of gravity relative to the lift fixture. Remove the ratchet and the drive adapter and unpin the pusher-puller. As the low-pressure turbine is moved out, the alignment fixture stays with the LPT shaft and is withdrawn through the center of the core. With the aid of the lift fixture, pull the low-pressure turbine major module back about 15 inches. Position the centering fixture onto the low-pressure turbine shroud support and secure the sectors to the flange. Then install the centering clamp. Now fully withdraw the low-pressure turbine module from the rest of the engine, adjusting the lift fixture as necessary to keep the turbine shaft in a horizontal position. Lower the module onto the storage and transportation stand with the shaft splines protruding from the pad and secure the handling fixture. engage the pad on the shaft and secure it in place. Now remove the alignment fixture from the shaft and install a protective cover onto the end of the shaft. Adjust the lift fixture tool center of gravity and remove the lift fixture from the low-pressure turbine major module. At the forward end of the engine, remove the counter-torque adapter from the residual torque beam by removing the bolts holding it in place. Next, remove the residual torque beam from the fan inlet case. Remove the pusher-puller by rotating it counterclockwise, forward-looking aft. Take it off carefully to prevent it from falling. Loosen the bolts that hold the guide and counter-torque fixture and the centering sleeve in place, and remove all of these from the fan disc. Remove the balance weight protective sleeve from the fan disc. Now go to the accessory gearbox and unfasten the bolts holding the locking adapter in the hand cranking drive and remove the locking adapter. Lightly coat an O-ring with oil and install it on the hand cranking drive cover. Install this cover, securing it in place with lightly greased bolts. Remove the 8 jack screws from the forward face of the core engine rear flange. At the aft end of the engine, engage the lugs of the counter-torque fixture with the bolts of the high-pressure turbine rotor, first taking care to slide a seal guard over the HPT rear shaft. Secure the counter-torque fixture with the bolts provided. Anytime that the low-pressure turbine is replaced, the number 4 bearing outer race must be removed from the core engine because it is part of a matched set. After removing the retaining ring from the number 4 bearing retaining nut, engage the spline wrench and the torque multiplier onto the number 4 bearing retaining nut. Using a ratchet, loosen the retaining nut. Remove the spline wrench and the torque multiplier and separate them. Now the retaining nut can be unscrewed and carefully removed from the engine. Next, the counter-torque fixture may be removed either by hand or with the aid of a hoist. Slide off the seal guard. The next tool to be used is the puller. This is installed onto the rear shaft of the high-pressure turbine rotor so that the 4 puller feet engage the forward face of the number 4 bearing race. Secure these 4 feet in the proper positions. When the puller is in place, slide the puller housing and the hydraulic actuator onto the shaft of the puller. Secure it with the nut provided. Attach the hose from a hydraulic pump to the hydraulic actuator and apply pressure to the bearing race. Support the puller assembly as it moves out of the rear shaft. Remove the hydraulic actuator by unscrewing the lug nut and sliding the actuator and its hose off of the puller shaft. Carefully pull the bearing race and the puller straight back from the rotor. Separate the puller housing from the shaft and remove the number 4 bearing race from the puller housing. The next step is to remove the core engine major module. First, take the air seal from out of the high-pressure turbine rotor. Then, remove the air duct from the rotor by sliding it straight back from the opening. On the core module aft restraining fixture, turn the retainer nut until it is completely forward. Turn the torque nut aft until its aft face is flush with the aft surface of the retainer nut. Install the fixture onto the Stage 1 LPT nozzle support with the top vertical mark aligned with the top vertical center line of the nozzle support. Guide the cap into the rear seal of the high-pressure turbine rotor. Secure this fixture to the core engine module flange with the bolts provided with the fixture. Install the bolts at the positions marked X on the lift fixture. Remove all the piping and hardware between the core engine major module and the fan major module in order to allow the two pieces to be separated. Using the hand cranking drive on the accessory gearbox, turn the rotor to position the 4 anti-torque slots in the end of the high-pressure compressor rotor front shaft at approximately the 12, 3, 6, and 9 o'clock positions. It may be necessary to use a light to visually align the slots. Tighten the retainer nut and the torque nut on the rear of the restraining fixture. Install the rotor lock, engaging the teeth into the slots which are present in the aft end of the high-pressure turbine rotor rear shaft. Then secure the rotor lock in place with a clamp nut. Install the torque screw into the threads of the high-pressure turbine rotor rear shaft. Tighten it into place with a clockwise turning motion. At the forward part of the engine, temporarily reattach the spinner rear cone with 6 bolts and washers, but do not over-torque. Install the guide into the fan rotor and attach it to the forward flange of the aft spinner section with the 6 bolts provided. At the aft of the engine, insert the guide tube through the high-pressure turbine rotor rear shaft and push the tube forward by hand until it seats against the aft surface of the HPC motor front shaft. Lightly coat the pilot tube of the locking nut wrench with petrolatum. Then attach a hoist to a lift fixture and the lift fixture to the locking nut wrench. Secure the wrench with a lock pin. By turning the ring depression nut clockwise, the ring depression feet will move into their most outwardly extended position. Before beginning, turn the ring depression nut counterclockwise to retract its feet to allow insertion. The foot actuation nut at the aft end of the wrench will extend and retract the nut torquing feet. These two should be retracted before insertion by turning counterclockwise. Move the spline adapter aft against stop and move the torque tube forward as far as possible by hand. With the aid of the hoist and lift fixture, insert the locking nut wrench into the core engine through the guide tube, engaging the pilot tube on the forward end of the wrench into the guide fixture attached to the fan rotor. Hold the wrench forward while slightly rotating the HPT rotor until the locating pins on the counter torque tube can be felt to enter the slots in the HPC rotor front shaft. At the same time, engage the holes in the counter torque tube flange over the pins at the 3 and 9 o'clock positions on the aft restraining fixture. Insert the engagement check pin into the inspection hole in the counter torque tube flange so that the tip of the pin is against the aft face of the tube guide. The counter torque tube is seated when the scribed line on the pin is flush with the aft surface of the counter torque flange. Turn the ring depression nut clockwise to expand and move the ring depression tube aft. This will depress the locking ring. Be careful not to over-tighten this nut because the tool and the engine parts may be damaged if this happens. Tighten the ring depression nut. Attach a lift and turn fixture on a hoist to the core module lift fixture with a lock pin. Make sure that the alignment and the center of gravity are properly adjusted. Install the fan frame supports and brackets to the front flange of the fan frame before removing the core engine. Insert the 3 guide pins into the fan frame flange in order to keep the two modules aligned as they are pulled apart. Make a final check to be sure that any tubing or hardware that could interfere with the separation has been removed. Loosen and remove the nuts and bolts that hold the forward high-pressure compressor stator case onto the fan frame. Turn the foot actuation wrench clockwise against the stop to extend the nut wrenching feet. Grasp the spline adapter and pull the torque tube aft while rotating the torque tube clockwise until the wrenching feet can be felt to enter the wrenching slots in the number 3 bearing lock nut. If properly engaged, it will now be impossible to push the torque tube forward. Install a torque multiplier over the spline adapter and engage the counter torque tube flange. Secure the torque multiplier with the hand knob on the counter torque tube. Turn the torque tube clockwise using a special keyed wrench to loosen the number 3 bearing lock nut. As the lock nut is loosened, the core engine will move aft. Observe the guide pins in the flange to be sure that the core remains level as it is moved. After the lock nut is disengaged, disengage the nut wrenching feet. Move the core engine major module aft by hand with the aid of the hoist and the lift and turn fixture. Maneuver the suspended core engine major module over the dolly and carefully lower it onto the supports. Attach the forward flange brackets and the aft restraining fixture to the dolly supports. Make sure that the center of gravity on the lift fixture is properly adjusted before removing it from the core engine module. After removing the torque multiplier from the nut wrench, Retract the lock ring depression feet by turning the depression ring tube nut counterclockwise. With the hoist attached to the lift fixture and wrench, pull the nut locking wrench assembly aft and remove it from the core engine major module. Remove the guide tube from the high-pressure turbine rotor. Remove the keyed retaining ring from the front shaft of the compressor rotor. Install a support fixture to the forward flange of the high-pressure compressor stator and secure it with the bolts and nuts provided. Secure the clamping bracket of the fixture around the high-pressure compressor rotor front shaft. Remove and discard the O-ring from the stationary aft air seal of the fan frame. The removal of the core engine major module now is complete. In preparing the fan major module for assembly with the core engine, you must first install 3 guide pins, equally spaced, in the fan frame aft flange. To prepare the core engine major module, install the keyed retaining ring into the slots of the rotor forward shaft. Also, clean and lubricate the HPC shaft and IGB nut threads. Next, calculate the core seating dimension. After removing the knurled knob and aft plate of the clamping fixture, insert the forward plate of the special measuring fixture into the aft end of the inlet gearbox and seat on the forward face of the number 3 bearing lock nut. Install and tighten the knurled knob so that the aft plate seats in number 3 rotating seal. Measure the distance between the aft surfaces of the forward and aft plates. Record as dimension M. After installing the number 3 bearing locking nut wrench, measure and record dimension T from the forward face of the depressed retaining ring on the high-pressure compressor rotor front shaft to the seating shoulder. Subtract dimension T from dimension M and record as calculated seating dimension U. Next, install the fan module to core module guide to the fan frame. After heating the inlet gearbox horizontal level gears, carefully move the core engine major module forward to engage the HPC rotor forward shaft with the IGB. Rotate the IGB through the transfer gearbox hand cranking pad to allow spline engagement if necessary. Engage the lock nut wrench to the IGB lock nut. Install the torque multiplier and tighten the lock nut in a counterclockwise direction. To prevent binding of the core rotor and stator, loosen both the torque nut and retainer nut of the retaining fixture. Torque the number 3 bearing lock nut to the seating torque. Then loosen and retorque to the final torque, as indicated in the shop manual. Attach the HPC stator to the fan frame. Remove the 3 guide pins. Install bolts and torque. After securing the core module to the engine maintenance stand and removing both the core lift fixture and torque multiplier, prepare to remove the number 3 bearing lock nut wrench. First, turn the foot actuation wrench counterclockwise to retract the nut wrenching feet. Turn the ring depression nut counterclockwise to retract the ring depression feet. Pull the wrench assembly aft and carefully remove it from the core engine major module. After removing the guide from the fan frame, use a borescope in the inside of the HPC rotor front shaft to check the locking teeth engagement. A special gauge is used to measure the actual core seating dimension U. It is required that this gauge be properly calibrated prior to its installation into the fan module. Then the actual dimension U is compared to the calibrated dimension U to determine the proper core seating. Next, certain measurements must be taken prior to installing the number 4 bearing race assembly. Then install and align the air duct into the rear shaft. After lubricating, install the oil seal into the shaft, aligning the slots in the seal with those of the air duct. Next, using a heater, heat the aft shaft to 325 to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. After installing the number 4 bearing outer race onto the installation tool, place the race onto the shaft, aligning the tangs on the race with the oil seal. Make sure to wear clean, lint-free white gloves when handling bearing hardware. After lubricating with grease, install the number 4 bearing retainer by hand. After installing the seal guard, install the spline wrench and engage it with the bearing retainer. Once the torque multiplier is installed, torque the number 4 bearing retainer and install the lock ring. Refer to the shop manual for the proper torque. Measure and record the dimension from the aft end of the retainer to the aft end of the rear shaft. Then compare it to the calculated dimension to determine the proper seating of the assembly. Install 2 wood shims at the 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock positions between the blade tip and shroud, and lower HPTR to rest on the shims. Break off the excess shim aft of the LPT nozzle trailing edge. Install the LPT stop tools at the 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock locations of the aft side of the HPT shroud support. Install and secure the 3 equally spaced orientation blocks on the rear flange of the combustion case. Finally, install the LPT shaft guide tool to the aft HPTR shaft. Before beginning the installation of the LPT major module, we must first take some measurements. First, determine the thickness of the shim D48. This is used to ensure that the rotor is properly positioned. It can be determined by subtracting dimension ZF from dimension X. Dimension ZF is the distance from the forward flange of the turbine case to the seating shoulder on the low-pressure turbine shaft. Dimension ZF will be engraved on a label located at the 730 position on the forward flange of the turbine frame. Dimension X is a sum of dimensions LV, VC, and YA. Dimension YA is the length of the core engine found on a tag located at the 5 o'clock position on the flange between the compressor front stator case and the forward stator case extension. Dimension VC, the length of the fan frame, will be engraved on the outside of the frame at the 830 position. Dimension LV is the distance from the rear flange of the number 1 and number 2 bearing support to the seating of the fan shaft and is always equal to 5.533 inches. Now, subtract dimension ZF from dimension X to obtain dimension D48. Then, select the shim to be installed by referring to the table in the shop manual. Next, measure and record the following dimensions. First, measure VD on the fan shaft, which is the thickness of the seating shoulder inside the fan shaft. D48, the thickness of the shim. Dimension ZJ, which is the axial length of the low-pressure turbine coupling nut. Finally, measure dimension ZK, which is the distance from the forward end of the LPT shaft to the seating shoulder on the shaft. Now calculate so that ZL equals the sum of ZJ, VD, D48 minus ZK. Place the shim on the shaft and be sure that the deep groove is to the rear and that it completely seats against the turbine shaft. Next, install the guide and counter torque fixture on the fan disc. Install the centering sleeve torque and secure it on the fixture. Place the residual torque beam on the fan inlet case at 6 o'clock. Secure to the forward flange with bolts. Now install the pusher-puller fixture and screw it in completely. Install the counter torque adapter onto the residual torque beam and secure with bolts and ball lock pin. Next, install the guide tool on the LPT shaft. Now, slowly align the shaft, centering it in the guide tool on the HPTR shaft. Slowly move the LPT forward until it is 13 inches away. Remove the shaft supports. Then remove the shaft guide tool and continue forward until the splines are engaged and module is set against the stop at 6 o'clock. After measuring the gap between the 12 o'clock stop and the flange, move the LPT module aft to the 13-inch position again. Install the HPT shaft heater and heat the outer race to a minimum of 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Heating the outer race to 425 to 450 degrees would allow for more time for installation. Remove the heater. And then the support fixture. Slowly move the LPT forward until the splines are engaged with the fan shaft. Then engage the ball pins to lock the pusher-puller fixture to the alignment fixture. Install the drive adapter and lock it to the alignment fixture with the ball pin. A special torque multiplier, which was not available at the time when shooting this videotape, must be used to properly seat the LPT shaft in the fan shaft. After lightly coating the bolts with graphite grease, secure the front flange of the LPT case to the core engine. Next, remove the tooling from the aft end. Remove the handling fixture. Then remove the holding fixture. By disengaging the lock pin, remove the drive adapter. Remove the pusher-puller fixture and centering sleeve. Finally, remove the counter torque adapter. Next, install the residual torque adapter onto the residual torque beam and secure with bolts. Place the LPT shaft coupling nut on the locking nut wrench. Engage it on the LPT shaft and hand tighten. Using extreme caution, put the torque multiplier onto the torque wrench and secure it. Torque the coupling nut in accordance with the shop manual. Check for alignment of the coupling nut slot with the LPT shaft forward end slot by engaging the locking pin of the forward wrench into the alignment fixture. Next, install the turbine frame aft support and secure to the outer support with ball pins. Also, remove the tooling from the front end. Measure dimension ZL between the forward end of the LPT shaft and the forward face of the LPT coupling nut. Verify that ZL measured does not exceed ZL calculated. If it does, the LPT coupling nut must be removed and verified. Place a new O-ring, lightly coated with engine oil, on the front end of the LPT shaft plug. Next, install the LPT shaft plug into the forward end of the shaft and onto the center vent tube. When doing this, insert the lug of the LPT shaft plug in the aligned slots of the LPT coupling nut and LPT shaft. Install the retaining ring on the LPT shaft. Check dimension ZG between the aft end of the LPT shaft and the aft face of the number 5 bearing support. Dimension ZG must be within tolerances described in the shop manual. Next, prepare the aft air oil separator for installation. First, chill the forward end of the air oil separator for 5 minutes using dry ice. Then, place the separator offset slot on axis of the extension duct top point. The separation offset slot is identified by a spherical indentation on the slot aft end and is aligned with an identical indentation on the shaft. First, remove the protector from the center vent tube rear extension duct. Position the air oil separator on the rear extension duct, engaging separator lugs in extension slots. Measure dimension ZH between the aft end of the air oil separator and the aft end of the center vent tube rear extension duct. Install the air oil separator nut and torque. Next, install the oil inlet cover with puller adapter matching the position of the cover flange with the oil scavenge tube protruding at the bottom of the number 5 bearing support. Secure with bolts and remove the puller adapter. Install the oil bearing supply tube between the nipple assembly and the oil inlet tube on the number 7 strut of the turbine frame. Position the outer end of the tube parallel to the turbine frame aft flange. Torque the nuts. After lightly greasing the bolts, install the flange assembly onto the turbine frame. Install the cage assembly onto the flange assembly and secure all bolts. Next, install 3 guide pins on the forward flange disc with the longest pin installed in the offset hole. Using a heat gun, heat the aft flange of the spinner rear cone to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Noting that the offset hole in the rear cone is identified by a spherical indentation, install the spinner rear cone onto the fan disc forward flange, aligning the offset holes. Secure the spinner cone with bolts, washers, and torque. Next, check gap F34, which must be within 14 thousandths to 48 thousandths of an inch. Heat the forward flange of the spinner rear cone to 175 degrees Fahrenheit. Install the spinner front cone onto the spinner rear cone. Once again, note the indentation on the mounting flange when aligning the offset holes. Torque the bolts. Finally, complete the installation by installing the engine tubing and the thermocouple harnesses. This completes the installation of the engine major modules. For more complete information on this procedure, refer to the engine shop manual.